makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
A few days ago, the city of Kherson, which was the only regional capital to be captured by Russia, was finally liberated by Ukraine in an operation that, at least taking the city itself, was largely bloodless, which I'm going to explain in a bit why this is important and what it means for the future of Ukraine's military operations. But in the meantime, some videos of the celebrations, which were incredible. I mean, it looks like Ukraine won the World Cup just by looking at this. And when I see videos like this, is really when you realize that Ukraine's cause is the just cause. There is just no argument that any sensible leftist should support Russia in its war of occupation and cultural genocide, which is what it is, and not feel just incredibly happy at looking at people celebrating this way, celebrating that they finally kicked their occupier out, and yeah, can look forward to freedom again, freedom from invasion, freedom from, I mean, maybe not freedom from all the ravages of war. I mean, this is a city that can still be attacked with drones. It can still be attacked with artillery. So it's not fully a return to normal for them, but at least they don't have to worry about Russian soldiers on the streets, possibly people disappearing. I mean, we're likely to see some horrendous. Every time a major city gets liberated, we end up discovering a lot of war crimes that Russians committed, and this is so far the largest city that has been liberated. So I have no doubt in my mind that over the next couple of days or weeks, we're going to find some pretty horrible things around there. But yeah, so good news, the Russians are finally out. And like I said, we should be celebrating this. This is the joy of liberation. I don't think we've seen it in Europe, at least since World War II. And I'm still shocked that you don't hear a peep about this from so many channels on the left, so many leftist personalities who have just completely lost any sort of empathy and sympathy for the plight of Ukrainian people. And when they see this, I have a feeling that they're angry. They're genuinely just coping and trying to find some way of spinning this into a narrative that fits ultimately Putin's agenda, which is what it is. I don't think everyone on the left is a tanky, or at least on the anti-war left is fully a tanky, but a lot of them are just useful idiots for Putin. So it's a shame that this does not bring them joy. And I hate to break it to them, there's going to be more scenes like this over the next month. So keep coping. Anyway, what does this mean for longer term prospects and operations in the next couple of weeks or months? So let's look at, I haven't made a video on strategy and operations in a while. So here are my thoughts. And first and foremost, there's a talking point that goes around that I think I need to debunk it, and that is winter is coming. That means there's going to be an operational pause. Neither side is going to be able to really mount any serious strategic offensives until after the winter. And the answer to that is no. There is nothing preventing either side from undertaking offensive operations during winter. And I'll explain. As long as you're prepared for winter, that is, you have adequate logistics, your soldiers are well clothed with winter gear. Winter can actually be pretty good for mechanized warfare. You have frozen ground. Often small streams are also frozen, so you can cross them easy. So it's actually, in many ways, it gives you some advantages to make offensive operations during winter. Now, if you go back to World War II, most of the Soviet Union's major offensives, at least in the first half of the war, took place during winter. So you had their counteroffensive after the Battle of Moscow. That was during winter. You had their counteroffensive after the Battle of Stalingrad. That was in winter. You had some other operations from then on in Eastern Europe as well. You had the Vistula Oder operation, which was their last offensive before the Berlin operation. Uh, that was also during winter. So yeah, I mean, the war started in winter. Uh, so there's nothing. I feel in this part of the world sometimes actually the beginning of spring is a worse time to mount offensives because then you get the mud, and I think mud is more of an impediment to mechanized warfare than winter is. Now there could be obviously a big snowfall, etc., which will pause operations, but it doesn't mean that this will be a pause that will last more than a couple of days or maybe a couple of weeks. I simply do not think that winter as a whole is an impediment for operations on either side. So, with that out of the way, nothing stops Ukraine from mounting further offensives. The question is, where are they going to do it? And that is the big if. Now, we've seen the front pretty much narrow over the last couple of months. So first, as a result of the Kharkiv operation in the northeast, so that liberated a good chunk of territory around here and sort of straightened the front to the border of Luhansk. Then we had the operation here in the south, where the west bank of the Dnieper River was liberated. Now, crossing the Dnieper is rough. I mean, this is a very wide river. The Russians blew up the bridges after they fled to the eastern bank. There is, and obviously the right side, the left side, which would be the eastern side of the river, is pretty well fortified. You have some pretty good units, Russian units, a lot of VDV units, airborne units, still defending it. Those were the ones that were on the west side and fled. So it is not easy to cross a river, and I don't think Ukraine is going to mount any sort of major operation across the river. This does not preclude like small raids, special forces at night, etc. I'm sure that that's going to happen, but not a serious attempt to move numerous brigades across the river, insofar as the East Bank is still held by Russian forces. That still doesn't mean that there aren't some other kind of auxiliary operations that they could use. And one that has been discussed a lot is this little peninsula over here called the Kinburn Peninsula. Now, this peninsula is somewhat important, and I'll explain why. Sorry. There we go. So this peninsula, first of all, is a very difficult, terrain-wise. There's hardly any roads. It's not there's no major cities. There's nothing. It's just basically wilderness. This peninsula is obviously within access of special forces operations mounting a very quick amphibious raid. And it is basically an area that the Russians are now forced to occupy. I think they took it, but didn't really occupy it, so to speak, because like I said, there's nothing there. But now they're going to be forced to, or at least they're going to be forced to kind of plug this hole in the event that Ukrainian units start using the peninsula as a base of operations. Again, could be anything from special forces raids. So it's not necessarily that Ukraine is going to land on the peninsula and hold it, but it is a staging ground for things that they can do from there. This could be, sort of temporary drone bases. I don't know. It's also a difficult peninsula from a naval perspective. But you can say, okay, well, the Black Sea Fleet can sort of move in here and prevent that from happening. Except they can't, because now they're in range of Neptune missiles. Remember, the Neptune missiles were the ones that were used to sink the Moskva cruiser. So Russia has understandably kept their fleet in port very far away from the range of those missiles. So any operation where they would bring ships within Neptune missile range, I think would be incredibly stupid, incredibly suicidal. So that's the big dilemma for Russia. And the interesting thing about this is that merely the threat of Ukraine doing this means that Russia will have to expend some units in preventing that from happening. So Ukraine can even just not do anything. Just the mere threat that they could do something is enough to divert some forces to protect that very vulnerable part of the of what's left of the Kherson Oblast. Now, where else could Ukraine strike? So we've discarded the possibility of a river crossing in the Dnieper, and this obviously would be a minor operation. This is not where you would expect numerous brigades to land and then suddenly make an invasion of this part of the east part of the river. So that's not happening. So any future operations are going to happen in the east. And what are the two main options? Well, there's three options actually. The first is the most obvious one. And I've said this in a previous video, I'm sure. If not, I've said it on Twitter. The single most important offensive that Ukraine can undertake from a strategic perspective is here in the south. So an operation that would, break the Russian line here, either head into Melitopol or head towards Mariupol or head towards the coast, especially going towards Melitopol, because then you start threatening Crimea. And you not only threaten Crimea, but you also threaten to encircle the Russian forces that are on the east bank of the river. So this would be catastrophic for Russia. If Ukraine were to mount an offensive towards Melitopol, take it or bypass it or whatever, but just, get towards Crimea and hit the east bank of the Dnieper from behind, that would be absolutely catastrophic for Russia. Now, Russia has had basically 7 months or so to prepare for this, because if you think about it, they captured most of this territory during the first days of the war, first weeks at the most, and they haven't mounted any major operation since. The only major operation in the southern front, or I would call this the southeastern front, has been to take Mariupol. And I said this also at the very beginning when Mariupol was being besieged. I said, this is in many ways a Pyrrhic victory for Russia, because the forces that could have been used for further offensive operations later on, when Russia did their Donbass offensive, were forces that were instead spent on taking Mariupol and then were in no condition to join that offensive. So that was a Pyrrhic victory. Mariupol, I will insist, was a Pyrrhic victory for Russia. And it's basically led to the southern front being completely unable to mount any sort of offensive operation since. And so what they've had to do over the past couple of months is simply dig in. So this on paper looks like very difficult to defend territory because it's very flat. That's also what made it so easy to capture during those first days. But they've had a lot of time to build trenches, build bunkers, build a semi-functioning logistical system that will make this very hard to take. So this, and the fact that it's the obvious area in which Ukraine could strike, makes it unlikely that they're going to do it. Why? Because Ukraine has also been playing the game of we're not doing what you think we're doing. And that has been very, very wise on their part, because they want to avoid as much as possible any operation that will result in very heavy casualties. So their strategy of kind of attacking Russia's logistical system, wearing them down to the point where, this is what they did to recapture Kherson. Basically strike at Russia's logistical capability in resupplying the west bank of the Dnieper through HIMARS strikes, artillery strikes, whatever, and they wore it down over the course of well over a month, 2 months more or less, and then finally got to the point where Russia had no hope whatsoever of maintaining any kind of defensive position on the west side of the bank of the river. So they decided to retreat. So that's a strategy that I think that they're going to keep using, because it's a strategy that is well within their technological capacity, in light of the fact that they now outrange the Russians in terms of artillery, and it helps reduce casualties. Now, there was a recent statement by by was it who was it? Was it the chief of staff of the U.S. who said that he thought that Ukraine and Russia had suffered more or less the same amount of casualties, like 100,000. I actually think that he's wrong, and I actually think he might be deliberately wrong. I think he might be just the U.S. has been very good at like giving mixed signals to Russia, and so I think all their statements are kind of perfectly coordinated in a sense to not give Russia a good impression of what they're actually thinking and what they're actually doing. But I don't think that there's any reason to suspect that Ukraine has suffered the same amount of casualties as Russia has. I just don't think. I mean, even taking a very pessimistic view that Ukraine has suffered maybe half as many casualties as Russia, which I think is possible. I think the Ukrainian, if the Russian casualty figure is about 80,000, I would definitely agree that Ukraine's is probably around 40. This is not out of the question. But still, the fact is, you look at the Ukrainian army, it looks much better motivated, much better shape than Russia's. So I don't think this would be the result of an army that has suffered the same amount of casualties as its opponent. So I think there's something fishy going on there. I think those numbers are being used to mislead Russia, and I don't think they represent what most people, or at least what intelligence services really know about the state of Ukrainian casualties, which have been deliberately kept under wraps. And so, yeah, you can only guess how bad they are, and I do think they're bad, but just not as bad as Russia's. Anyway, this leaves two other areas. One is, again, the ongoing Donbass battle front, which is where most of the fighting has happened, aside from the Kherson area. So Russia continues to attack in this part of the front. You know, Bakhmut has been under siege now for months. There's ongoing Russian offensives here. I mean, they still, take a small village every so often. This is pretty much a static line, but one in which Russia is the one that's doing the attacking. And it's very costly for them. They haven't really broken through. I don't think they will. But this still represents a massive concentration of Russian forces in this area. And I just don't think Ukraine really is that stupid that they would want to attack the area where most Russian forces are. So I think we can safely discard that there's going to be a major operation in this area. I think Ukraine is just happy to hold on to it with the minimum amount of troops that they guarantee that Russia is not going to break through. I think that is the strategy, and I think that's a good strategy. So that leaves the northern part of the front, Luhansk. And if you think about it, this is exactly where Ukraine struck at the beginning of, was it September or October? I keep forgetting. And they liberated the most amount of territory in a single operation. And it was, I would say, it was their most resounding success. I think this was, a battlefield rout in every sense of the word, because, the Battle of Kiev, to some extent, was a Russian retreat. The Battle of Kherson was also, to some extent, a Russian retreat. They weren't routs. This was a rout. They got their butts kicked. Okay? So, could Ukraine decide to follow up on this and take more territory in the Luhansk area? And knowing as well that, for example, Wagner, which has been doing much of the fighting around Bakhmut, has been preparing defenses sort of in this part of the front, but not in the north. It is conceivable to think that the northern part is not as well defended and would be vulnerable to another Ukrainian attack. So I would say that is perhaps the slightly more likely direction. I still wouldn't bet on anything. It just depends on what are Ukraine's capabilities for an offensive, how many fresh mobile brigades they can muster up for a major offensive, how much artillery support they can give them, and more importantly, I assume that they've done sufficient recon to know exactly where the Russian lines are weakest so that they can take advantage of that. I still think the odds of a more successful offensive in the north would make that the likely area. But, you know, they might just try something in the south, which, like I said, I think from a strategic perspective is much more important than the north. I don't think the north really matters that much unless they want to cut some of the supply lines uh, into here. But I don't think that's I don't think that's a big deal, because I mean this part of the front is being supplied by the supply lines from the east. So I wouldn't say that that's a very huge deal. So we'll see. I definitely think that we will see something happen before the end of the month, if not in December. But I definitely think Ukraine is up to something. There's been some hints here and there from some of the Twitter accounts that I follow, very cryptic. These guys obviously know more than I do, and they're very careful to not drop, you know, obvious statements. But there have been some hints that something is in the works, and that it won't be what Russia expects. So, what is it that Russia expects? I would say that Russia would probably fear most an attack that would threaten simultaneously Crimea and the east bank of the Dnieper, especially now that it's just fresh from the Kherson defeat. So if that's what Russia expects, then maybe Ukraine is not going to do that, and they're going to do something in the north instead. I'm not going to bet on any of it. I'm just leaving this as a discussion of the possibilities that I see. But I think anything sort of in the center of the front, I would rule it out. Doesn't seem to make sense. And like I said, too much concentration of Russian firepower still here. Just let them keep attacking, let them get worn out. And when the time comes, then there can be a proper counterattack. So, but again, odds aren't zero. Maybe they do know something that I don't. Maybe the Russians are more worn out than I think. Who knows? Who knows? Yeah, that's all. That's my thoughts. But yeah, I just want to emphasize a bit that just because winter is coming does not mean that Ukraine cannot go on the offensive. So let me know in the comments, where do you expect Ukraine to strike next? And yeah, we'll see what happens. In the meantime, gotta say it, Slava Ukraini. I hope they win. And on that note, if you like this video, please like, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe. I will see you next time.